entire globe, involving hundreds of different cultures, explaining the same phenomenon by different names.
The nature of the footprints, namely their remarkable consistency, their biomechanical appropriateness, those aspects that are extremely compelling.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Bigfoot Influencers. I'm Dana Halloran.
And I'm Tim Halloran. How's everyone doing? How are you doing?
I'm doing good. You going to ask them how they're doing?
Yeah, well,
okay.
We're going to ask them how they're doing.
You can type in how you're doing. We're doing really well.
And we're thrilled to be here.
We are super thrilled. We have a very special guest today. His name is Dustin Severs, and he wrote a really cool book. And we're super excited about introducing him to you guys.
Yeah, it's books really intriguing, and we're going to recommend the audience to read it. It's, if you really want to get into the history, and we're going to ask Dustin later outside his book, because as you guys know, who all you who watch this, sometimes we ask our guests what books do they recommend for newbies, or just people, not even newbies, just people who are interested in the subject. And this is going to fall into one of those categories as one of those historical books it's a must read. So
yeah, and I think that's super important that we have these type of books around, and because new people who come onto the subject, they can get lost in all the names and the dates and who's doing what and who was where and who liked who and, the whole thing. And this book kind of encompasses all of that between a period of time. So let's bring him in.
Yeah, definitely. Let's do it.
Great.
Hey, Dustin.
Hey, Dustin.
Tim and Dana, thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome to the show. We're so super excited to have you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
So yeah, Dustin, we were just talking about the book. Normally we lead into other things, but why don't you tell everybody about your book?
Yeah, sure.
Well, not the whole entire book, but you know what I'm saying, like more or less. What is the book about?
So the book over my right shoulder has some shameless product placement going on here. It's called The Abominable Snowman of California. So unlike the vast majority of Bigfoot books over the last half century, it's not an analytical book. It's not looking at examining evidence or looking at whether or not Bigfoot exists. It's a historical narrative, and looking at the origin story of the Bigfoot in terms of American popular culture or general popular culture in North America. And I specifically look at what I call the classic period, which is from the origin of the Bigfoot legend in popular culture. I always have to stress that popular culture, which began in October of 1958, not far from where I live. And I cover a period up to October 1967. For those anybody familiar with the Bigfoot legend, that date should be obvious. That's when the Patterson-Gimlin film was shot. So the classic period is that nine-year period before the Patterson-Gimlin film was shot, and it really focuses on the small fraternity of the original Bigfoot researchers and some really fascinating personalities. So that's the book in a nutshell.
Yeah, we're going to get into that a little bit. So that's awesome.
Yeah. So just out of curiosity, what got you interested in the subject in the first place?
It's a pretty common story. So as a kid, I grew up watching all those classic documentaries. Actually, let me back up a little bit. I dedicated the book to the Gen X. The reason being is Generation X is that generation who came of age, were kids during the 1970s when Bigfoot went from being this obscure legend of the Pacific Northwest to being a household name. So yeah, so I think Bigfoot holds a special place in the heart for people who are Gen Xers. Technically, I am a Gen Xer. I was born in 1979. So though I didn't grow up living throughout the 1970s, I watched all those classic documentaries from the 70s and the 80s. That's what really hooked me into it. And then when I moved to the Pacific Northwest, specifically Southern Oregon, in the spring of 2016, that's kind of what reinvigorated my interest in the subject matter, which led to the book, which I started.
So wow.
17.
Yeah, 2016. That wasn't that long ago, Dustin. you've been super busy just informing yourself and, getting really into it. Kind of like us as well. This is probably like that. We've been seriously into it probably since just 2019. So that's awesome that you were able to like gather all of this stuff up and put it into a book. So you were saying before how, your book is capturing a lot of the small group of researchers who were studying this phenomenon before the Patterson-Gimlin film. So can you tell us some of the key players in this group of people?
Yeah, sure. So in the book, I call it the Bigfoot Vanguard. These are the 5 big ones. So it's the 2 Sasquatch hunters, which are Renee DeHaven and John Green, both from British Columbia, Canada. You have the 2 Yeti hunters, which are Tom Slick and Peter Byrne, who actually just passed away in July of this year. The final one is a man by the name of Ivan Sanderson, who was a writer, a quite famous naturalist writer during the 50s, 60s, and even up to the 70s. And he was the person who first wrote the article about Bigfoot in True magazine in 1958. And he was also the person who wrote the first article about the Patterson-Gimlin film that was shown in Argosy magazine in 1968. And there's also some of the local people who lived there in Humboldt County around the Eureka, California area, and those included Andrew Gonzoli, who was the writer who effectively coined the name Bigfoot. You had a lady named Betty Allen, who was a stringer reporter for the Humboldt Times, and you also have Jerry Cruz, the first person who saw the footprints, who had his picture in the newspaper, and also Betty Allen. There's quite a number of people, but the interesting story is this same small cast of characters throughout this, not only this story, but throughout the 1970s. It's this main nucleus of individuals.
So can I ask you what inspired you? I mean, how'd you go from in 2016 to getting involved in the subject, and what inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, sure. So, I've always been fascinated by origins. First, I love history. I've always been a student of history, and I particularly love origin stories. Anytime I come across a fascinating subject, I always want to know, how did this all start? So as far as my story, when I moved here in 2016, one of the first things I did, this was in March 2016, is I wanted to visit Humboldt County and Bluff Creek and those historic locations. So I went there, saw the redwoods for the first time, went through Eureka, I went over the hill on Highway 299. Now I went into Willow Creek, which is considered the gateway to Bigfoot country. While I was there, I met Stephen Struford. I went to his bookstore. I also met Jamie Wayne. They said, hey, they gave me a map I still own today that shows you how to get to the Patterson-Gimlin site. And they invited me to go to their yearly camp out. And I did so, and that's where I met the rest of the Bigfoot or the Bluff Creek Project guys, such as Rowdy Kelly and Robert Leiterman. And I've been going to Bluff Creek with those guys at least twice, sometimes 3 times a year ever since. And that's really what got me interested in possibly looking at. Actually, the first thing I did, like at anything, is I bought all the books I could find on the subject matter. I was shocked at how little there was about the history of Bigfoot, particularly, again, the small fraternity of guys who really popularized the legend in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And there are a couple good books, but they really didn't go into great depth. So it was my goal to really write the most comprehensive book ever about, again, the origin story of Bigfoot during this classic period.
Yeah, and one of the things that you didn't mention right now in regards to the OG researchers is, was there anything in there about Grover Krantz?
No, he doesn't enter the picture until 1969. So I'm actually working on a sequel to the book, and he's one of the most prominent characters in that second book. So a lot of people refer to the, what they call them, the Big Four, the Four Horsemen, and those are Peter Byrne, Renee DeHaven, and John Green, also Grover Krantz. So mine's a little different because, again, Grover doesn't come into the picture until 69. So I feel like Ivan Sanderson, somebody who's very overlooked, and also Bob Titmus is another character who's really overlooked in the Bigfoot story.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why do you think? I mean, I know the answer. Well, at least my opinion of the answer. But why do you think, for the audience, Ivan T. Sanderson was so impactful, and who, maybe you can say a little bit about who he is or was.
Sure. Yeah, so Ivan Sanderson, he was Scottish born, even though he spoke with like kind of a haughty English accent. So he was a naturalist, quite famous naturalist. In his books, he has some well-read books in the 1930s and the 1950s. And he also was a cryptozoologist. He's actually the one who coined the name cryptozoology. Him and the Bernard Heuvelmans are considered the godfathers of cryptozoology. And he was also really fascinated with the abominable snowman of the Himalaya, or the Yeti, in the 1950s, which led to his interest in Bigfoot later in 1958. So he was a really one person who introduced Bigfoot to the world through the True magazine article. So the first article on Bigfoot was written by Andrew Gonzoli in October of 1958 in the Humboldt Times newspaper. And a year later, Ivan Sanderson wrote a story in True magazine. And back then, in the 50s, millions of people read magazines. So it was read by millions of people. And again, and then in 1967, he was the first person to introduce the Patterson-Gimlin film to the world through Argosy magazine. So he's perhaps one of the most impactful, if not the central feature in popularizing Bigfoot in America.
So, in your opinion, Dustin, because the Bigfoot phenomenon was so universal at the time, like you're having regular everyday people reading about Bigfoot, do you think that the believing in Bigfoot was more widely accepted during that time period?
Yes, I think so. And I say by the late 1950s, early 1960s, I say if you did a poll, the majority of people believed in the Yeti, or the abominable snowman of the Himalaya. It was something a lot of the most prominent Everest climbers, such as Edmund Hillary and Eric Shipton, they all gave the Yeti their stamp of approval. They believed in it. And also, this was a time when there's a lot of areas of North America that haven't been thoroughly explored. And I'll discount Alaska because I didn't come into the Union until 1959. So really, in 1958, when Andrew Gonzoli wrote his article and Jerry Crew found his track up in Bluff Creek in the Klamath Mountains of Northern California, that was really the final frontier in the lower 48 of the United States. That area really had not been explored at all. So it's really the ideal location for an animal such as Bigfoot to exist.
And even today.
Definitely. So, Dustin, did you come? What part of the country or world? I'm assuming you were born in the country. Were you before you went to Oregon, and then because you just mentioned that the landscape. What did you think when you first got out there to Bluff Creek into Southern Oregon, and when you just walked around in the woods?
Yeah, so I'm from the Midwest, Illinois, flat farmland, featureless. So I'd always had an affinity for the Pacific Northwest. I've always loved the big trees, and I think Bigfoot probably played a factor in my appeal for the Northwest also. So yeah, it definitely lived up to expectations when I came out here. And anybody who has not been, if you're a Bigfoot enthusiast, I mean, have you guys made your pilgrimage yet to Bluff Creek?
We just got back.
Well, we got to Bluff Creek.
Not Bluff Creek, but we did just get back because we're in Delaware, so we're really far away.
Oh, okay.
We actually made it to we went to Washington State. We just got back on Monday, so it hasn't even been a week yet that
we were in
been
Oregon
back.
and Washington.
So we were in Washington and Oregon. So yeah, it was definitely my first impression was it felt like I was in Jurassic Park.
Yeah,
because
you didn't make it into Northern California though.
No.
Yeah.
Well, next time
It's
you have to
just
get on the list, you can knock it all out. It's all pretty close. I mean, you drive through the redwoods and you go into Eureka, California, where the Humboldt Times was written. Then you go over Highway 299. You enter Willow Creek, which is the gateway to Bigfoot country. It's the most popular Bigfoot town in the world. It's where the Bigfoot legend really was popularized. And from there, it's not far to get up to Bluff Creek. And all the historic places in Bluff Creek are within like a couple mile radius of each other. You have the Louse Camp, which is where we do our yearly camp out. That's where that's where this Pacific Northwest expedition was held. Is also where all the loggers stayed in the 50s and 60s. And it's a couple miles down the road is the Patterson-Gimlin site. There's Laird Meadow where Roger Patterson saw his first track. It's all in very close area, so it's pretty cool, and it's really beautiful and isolated out there. I loved going to Bluff Creek. Now there was a lot of fires this year. Fortunately, it sounds like those areas that we typically go to weren't heavily impacted, so that's good news.
How did you spending time in the woods out there help or impact you writing the book?
I think it's important to kind of live and breathe the location you're writing about. So I think that's something that's always appealed to me. I know there's another book I'm interested in writing about local history here in Ashland, Oregon. It's also a place I can go to and kind of explore the areas where I write about. So I pretty much went everywhere with the exception I did not make it the Great Bear in British Columbia. That's on my list. And I did not go to the Himalaya, but I did go. Obviously, I've been to the Bluff Creek scores of time. I also visited some of the famous historic locations in British Columbia, guided by the gatekeeper up there, who is Thomas Steenburg. He took me to like the Ruby Creek location. He took me to the Canadian Pacific Railroad area where Jocko was allegedly found. So yeah, I've visited a lot of these places. I think that's really important as a writer to get a feel, live, breathe, and smell those areas that you write about.
Especially when you're writing about the history in particular, because obviously there's lots of places all around our country that have had Bigfoot sightings and footprints and all kinds of things. But yeah, I kind of felt like that for us when we went to the area, Dustin. It was like just being there was like in a temperate rainforest. It was like, this looks like a habitat for a Bigfoot or a large omnivore, just so much vegetation, rivers, just the perfect environment, cover, just being out in the middle of nowhere. What a great experience it was to get out there. And yeah, I would highly recommend anybody who's really into this subject to just get out there and see a prime location for this kind of animal.
Yeah, definitely. And super cool that you got to hang out with Mr. Steenburg. He was kind enough to help me with my book, my first book. And he's a cool guy. So, and such a historian, and that's fun, all stories. I mean, I know you already know, but just getting stories about some of the folks you're talking about from him. He came in obviously a little later than some of the other ones, but he was back in the day. We got to, talk to him quite a bit about it. My next question for you, Dustin, is, how did you come with the title of the book?
So the title of the book is I originally had that as a title for the introduction. I ended up making a change. I always fell in love with that title. So it's a play on the Abominable Snowman of the Himalaya, or the Yeti. So that was well known during the 1950s. It's really a household name by the late 1950s. Everybody had heard of the Abominable Snowman of the Himalaya. So when the story of Bigfoot came out in 1958, a lot of people poked fun of it, and they called it the Abominable Snowman of California, because obviously a snowman in sunny California on its face sounds a bit absurd. So I thought that would be a great title of the book.
Yeah, and what a great, it's definitely like an eye catcher for sure. It pretty much, what the book is going to be about. Which is sometimes hard to get all in a couple of words. So yeah, it was awesome.
What do you hope the audience, takes away from the book after they read it?
Well, again, I'm a skeptic, but I'm not an evangelical skeptic. I'm not Greg Long, like I always say. It's not my intent to convince somebody one way or another whether or not Bigfoot exists. So to me, I really want to shine a light on this original fraternity of guys such as John Green and Renee DeHaven. I feel like anybody who's interested in Bigfoot should really know their history, and you got to know these guys, particularly John Green and Renee DeHaven. Like I said, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin are considered the most famous, and they certainly are. But without a doubt, the OGs are John Green and Renee DeHaven.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. So can you talk a little bit about, how describe how you write the book, because it's interesting, the way the concept of what the readers can expect, because it's more of the conversation between, different characters.
Yes, I opted for a literary nonfiction approach, which means that it's probably 80% of the book is traditional informational nonfiction. It's like a journalist quoting individuals. And there's another 20% of the book where it is basically written like a novel, where it's set up with scenes and dialogue between the characters. I usually take the point of view of one particular person when I have those scenes. And it probably makes some people uncomfortable. But but in terms of, I took great pains to be as accurate as possible. A lot of the dialogue I used was actually quotes that these individuals actually said, and I just kind of took them out of context. So like I said, I took great lengths to be as accurate as possible. Really, I wanted to provide the reader with a kind of a fly on the wall perspective. I mean, everybody knows about these major events, but I wanted to put them right there, in Bluff Creek, and give them a more immersive, more intimate experience with these classic stories they've heard.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, for example, I give in one of the first chapters, I tell the entire chapter is told through Jerry Crew's perspective of when he first saw the tracks in late August of 1958, and then it carries on to a conversation he has with the Crew's foreman, Shorty Wallace, along with another man named Jay Rowland, who actually just passed away a few years ago. So I kind of took some of the most seminal events, and if there wasn't a lot of information out there, I just created a scene out of it, again, with dialogue between the characters.
So can you give us like a quick synopsis of this scene?
Speaking of the Jerry Crew scene, so he comes in the morning. It's a Monday morning. I can't remember the exact date. It was late August of 1958. He arrives. He's a cat scanner, which means he operates the tractor for the logging crew up in Bluff Creek. And one morning he arrives and he sees giant tracks all around his tractor. He's shocked at how large they are and how deep they're pushed into the soil. So then after that, he talks to his foreman, Shorty Wallace, who was Ray Wallace's brother, and kind of explained the situation. But Shorty was actually already familiar with the situation, as others have also reported of giant tracks, but he's kind of keeping on the low down because he felt like some of the natives were superstitious and they would quit the crew if they heard about that. But ultimately, Jerry Crew, a couple months later, decides to make a plaster cast, and he goes to the newspaper, gets his picture in the newspaper. The Bigfoot legend is born, and he goes on the Associated Press, and Bigfoot has his 15 minutes of fame. Yeah,
15 minutes. Yeah. Here we are.
Well, that's what I mean by 15 minutes. It kind of died away, and then it blew up. It really blew up in 68, and then in the 70s. I always say, like, when the REC magazine article was written in 68, it was the first article about the Patterson-Gimlin film. It was the first one that actually showed the color photos. Probably a small minority of Americans had ever heard of Bigfoot. By the end of the 1970s, by the time Ronald Reagan took the oath of office in 1981, everybody in the country had heard of Bigfoot. So it was really due to the Patterson-Gimlin film and the rise of Bigfoot throughout the 1970s. So I really focus on the 1970s in the second book I'm writing about. But yeah, that was the decade of Bigfoot, was the 1970s. It's all due to the Patterson-Gimlin film.
It was also the decade of amazing music. I'm coming to realize now. Like, I'm just like, we had the best music in the 70s.
Yeah, 70s and 80s. Yeah. 80s is different, but the 70s definitely was pretty cool.
It was a good decade.
Yeah, we're little. We're born in the 70s. We're a little older than you, Dustin. But so
Well, I was born in 1970.
70. Yeah, we're from the 70s.
And you were 1971.
I was close.
I
Yes.
robbed the cradle.
So I've got a bunch of questions related to what you just mentioned. I guess the first one would be, what do you think? Because you just mentioned how the Patterson-Gimlin film changed the minds of, or just really just made it so mainstream. Did you find that people thought Bigfoot was prior to, October 20th, 1967?
Yeah, so the Patterson-Gimlin film changed the Bigfoot legend in three fundamental ways. So before that, during the classic period, the period I write about, 58 to 67, really the image, the face of Bigfoot was these giant footprints in the earth, black and white images of these giant footprints and black and white images of plaster cast. That all changed with the Patterson-Gimlin film. Now the face of legend transitioned from tracks to these colored photos or a motion picture film of an actual Bigfoot. So, and another fundamental, or actually other fundamental ways it changes. Another one is the way people's conception of what Bigfoot was. During the classic period, most people thought Bigfoot was a wild man. It was actually
this was before the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Correct. Yeah. So the Sasquatch in particular was always considered a band of giant Indians, they said, and they thought Bigfoot was similar. So it was John Green who was the first one who argued that, hey, these aren't human beings. These aren't wild men. These are actually just large, new species of great ape, essentially like giant gorillas. And that's exactly what the Patterson-Gimlin shows, is essentially a large gorilla with human legs. So ever since then, now people think of Bigfoot, they think of a giant ape or gorilla, where that wasn't the case before that. Most people thought it was a wild man. And then the third major shift is what I already mentioned, is just the popularity just blew up. I mean, Bigfoot went mainstream in the 1970s. It was on TV. I mean, it
$1 Million Van.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one I remember.
Garnered the responsibility, or it garnered the title of being the second most watched amateur film in history, after the Zapruder film, which showed JFK's assassination in 1963.
We were just talking about that.
I told you.
Well, the Zapruder film didn't actually come out till I think 75 or 76. So, but this is all pre-internet. So since the internet, there's probably cat videos that have more views.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So,
Somebody's gotten a gazillion views on some kind of amateur.
And somebody here in the room does watch a lot of those cat videos.
Oh, you send them to me all the time.
So I want to get back to some interesting things you also mentioned before, when you're talking about Jerry Crew. And so can you share, for the audience that does not know, who the Wallaces were, or Ray Wallace in particular?
Mm-hmm. So the Wallace, there were several Wallace brothers. So four of them formed a construction company in the 1950s. They were what was called high lead loggers. So that's the type of logging that was specialized for really steep canyons. So basically just used a system of cables. So after the logging boom, and post-war logging boom, high lead logging was in high demand. And prior to that time, the Klamath Mountains, which contain the Bluff Creek, which actually I'm sitting on the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains right now. I just live about 70 miles from, as a crow flies, from Bluff Creek. So that was really a focus of logging after the war. And so the Wallace Brothers construction was called. They came to Bluff Creek in the late 1950s. And in the 1958 season, they hired a cat skinner or a tractor operator named Jerry Crew. And in the next year, that's when, or that summer and fall is when Jerry Crew came across the tracks, got his picture in the paper. Bigfoot blows up. Fast forward, years later, Ray Wallace is kind of exposed as being quite a wacky character. And on his death in 2002, his family claimed that he was responsible for faking the tracks, and they actually had a whole cache of giant wooden stompers, which actually fit the most prominent footprints from Bluff Creek in the 1950s. I mean, they're dead ringers. The most common track was called the double wall track. We had kind of a hourglass
Mm-hmm.
hourglass shape. And then also, but Jerry Crew's track, the first one he made a cast of that was shown in October 5th article was actually wasn't the hourglass or the double wall track. However, Ray Wallace had a track was identical to that. Now, to counter that argument, John Green argued that it's really a chicken or the egg argument. He said that Ray Wallace is simply taken. Well, let me back up a little bit. So in 1958, Jerry Crew and Bob Titmus, who were childhood friends, they actually made some tracks like plaster cast of to sell to tourists. I'm not sure what they were made of. I don't believe they were made of wood. Anyway, so it was John Green's argument that people had the Wallace brothers had simply molded their wooden stompers from these replica casts that were being sold to tourists. So it was really comes down to a chicken or the egg argument as to whether or not the Wallace family's claims were true or not. I should point out that Ray Wallace never claimed to have hoaxed while he was alive. This came out after his death in 2002.
Oh, that was interesting. I never knew that. I was always under the assumption that Ray Wallace, before he passed away, I mean, that he was known to being practical joker and making fake prints. That's cool. Good to know. So has anyone looked into, because there's no way to find out if Ray Wallace actually made tracks before, the fake stompers, before the stompers, because they're not fake, before Jerry Crew casted that print?
No, the mystery endures, and I like it that way.
Yeah, it is definitely interesting. That's always been fascinating to me. What came first? Like you said, the chicken or the egg, So,
Dustin, would you say that your book is kind of like more for people who want to know who is who and who is doing what between the years of 58 and 67 in the Bigfoot world, as opposed to actual witness sightings, or that's included as well in the book?
A little bit. So if you're an individual who's looking for, again, a more of an analytical book, examining whether or not Bigfoot exists, looking at eyewitness testimonies, etc., this is probably not the right book for you. So this book is specifically historic narrative. So you're more interested in the history of Bigfoot, particularly the origin story, dating back to 1958. I think this is definitely the right book for you.
So before you mentioned, and I asked you about if it seemed to you, in your opinion, after looking at the history between these 9 years, that people seem to accept this more as something that they could believe was true. What do you think happened from that point of 67 to where we are now, where people will kind of make fun of you if you believe in Bigfoot? People are a lot more skeptical. Like, what would you think that's the reason, or what would the reason be for that?
Well, we have to go back to the Yeti, or the Abominable Snowman of the Himalaya. I always call it it's the holy trinity of hairy monsters. You got the Yeti, you got the Sasquatch, and you got the Bigfoot. And I write about all three in the book. So the Yeti was really discounted in 1960, 1961 when Edmund Hillary, who was the conqueror of Everest, probably the most famous man in the world at the time, did an expedition for the Yeti. Upon his return, he announced that based on his evidence, he thought the Yeti was a myth, and never really recovered after that. So I think Bigfoot, in effect, lost a lot of credibility due to that. And John Green,
I'm sorry, Dustin. What do you think do you know what reasons he had for thinking it was a myth as opposed to an actual creature that exists?
Yeah, he gave various reasons. Actually, he went on record before that. He was actually a true blue believer in the Yeti. So was his companion Tenzing Norgay, who was also the native who was also went to the top of the mountain with him at the same time, as were all the most prominent mountaineers at the time. So Yeah, I guess he looked at the evidence, and I think he thought it was. I can't really recall his precise reasons, but he looked at the tracks. I think he assumed it was probably mistaken for a Himalayan red bear or some other species of animal, but he was convinced that it was a myth, and yeah, yet he never recovered from that, and. And then after that, John Green called it the quiet years, 1962 to 1967. Not much happened. That's largely due to the fact that Hillary's expedition, and Tom Slick was one of the prominent characters in the book. He tragically was killed in a plane crash in 1962. So in 1959, 60, 61, and 62, he had what was called the Pacific Northwest Expedition in Bluff Creek. He also had what's called the British Columbia Expedition, looking for the Sasquatch. So that was a big source of funding for the original fraternity of guys: Peter Byrne, John Green, Renee DeHaven, all these guys. So so the legend was really rejuvenated in 1967. I say it probably lost credibility is because it really became saturated in the 1970s. It started showing up on the National Enquirer and stuff, things of that sort. So.
And yeah, so you're talking about credibility, to the story, and their expeditions that they were doing during this time. And I'm not sure if you're really familiar with how a lot of expeditions are conducted today. So how would you, what were different about what their expeditions were like back then in that time period, as opposed to now?
I'm not really sure. So they, he had,
maybe they spent more time. Was it like months and months out looking? Because I don't know if we know anybody that's spending months and months out looking.
Well, I can share some information about that. Unless you want to jump in, Dustin. It's your show.
No, go ahead, Tim.
Well, so when I interviewed Peter Byrne for my book, and then I read one of his books, the one, The Search for the Yeti. That's not the title, but when he was and I think what happened is Peter spent months out there, and he started before he met Tom Slick, doing some local, and there was 15 or 20 of them out there on this expedition. They had people who cooked. It was crazy. It was like
almost like a safari.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it's reminding me of. And it went on for months,
and he would go out and then come back, and maybe resupply or something until he was planning for his second next expedition. So I think that might be different now. I think we just recently talked to someone that said that if it was a hunter, he said, if I could spend 2 or 3 months straight out in the woods, maybe we could find something.
Yeah.
And then I just want to say, I think what happened, and this kind of is going to lead me into my next thing with you, Dustin. Tom Slick had he funded Peter Byrne's expedition in the Himalayas, or Himalaya. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, if you do the S or not the S, but
Himalayas. I think there's one. Yeah.
And he was out there for a couple of years, I think. And then Tom Slick contacted Peter Byrne, and he said, I want you to come out here and help me find a North American Bigfoot, which Peter Byrne didn't know anything about until he got here. But then he had already, and again, Dustin, I'll have you correct me here. Before Peter Byrne got here, some of the folks were, Renee DeHaven and some of the folks were already, Bob Titmus, I think, and maybe John Green, were already involved with Tom Slick with the Pacific Northwest expeditions. Is that right, Dustin?
Yeah, that's correct.
And so then I think when Peter Byrne came here, Tom Slick asked him to kind of run the show.
Okay. And
I think, so this gets into my question with you, because there was not a lot of love between those guys. I think maybe that's where it started, because here comes this big shot, that comes in from the Himalaya expedition, and Tom Slick asks him to take over, kind of operations, and all the other guys were like, what the heck's going on here? Is that kind of what you found out too?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing about this original fraternity. Not only are they all individually fascinating characters, they all tended to hate each other. So there's alliances at a certain time, but the biggest rivalry was they pretty much all despised Peter Byrne, Bob Titmus, Renee DeHaven. Probably John Green despised them the most, and John Green Renee DeHaven and Peter Byrne actually got a fist fight in 1978. There's actually a police report from it. So it got really, the lawsuits, it got really, really nasty. So yeah, they and originally the Pacific Northwest expedition started in November 1959. So I actually have a scene from November 15th. Is when they first all met in Willow Creek. Actually, it was called White's Motel. Now it's called the Bigfoot Motel. Still there today. And that's when they formed the Pacific Northwest expedition. It was spearheaded by Bob Titmus, and then Renee DeHaven and John Green also came on. But yeah, you're correct. And eventually, he called in Peter Byrne, and at that time, Bob Titmus was effectively kind of kicked out or pushed aside by Peter Byrne. So Bob Titmus and Tom Slick always had a great relationship. So what happened is he formed the British Columbia expedition. So for the next couple of years, the Byrne brothers, both Peter and his brother Brian, ran the Pacific Northwest expedition in Bluff Creek, while Bob Titmus ran the British Columbia expedition up in the Great Bear in BC, and he was also occasionally joined by John Green. So this probably would have went on for the foreseeable future if it wasn't for the fact that Tom Slick was killed in October of '62 in a plane crash.
So what would you say?
Quiet years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what would you say were some of the reasons, maybe in your opinion or facts that you know, of all of the confrontation and disagreements?
I say originally, when I started my research, I assumed that Peter Byrne was despised because he was this handsome guy with the British accent, the Indiana Jones fedora, and he got all the attention, he got all the women. But the more research I did, I kind of understand where the resentment came from on Byrne. I mean, Byrne's books are I don't want to speak ill of the man. He just passed away. And I actually really admire Peter Byrne. That guy is a legend. I mean, he was hunting the legend. He was hunting the Yeti back in the 1940s. However, from his, as far as a writer, the information in his book is very inaccurate. I mean, demonstrably inaccurate. And so I tend to side with the John Green, Bob Titmus contingent when it comes to that debate between Peter Byrne and the rest of the fraternity.
Well, what were some of the inaccuracies?
Oh, I'll give you an example. So he said that in I can't remember which edition it was, in his book about Bigfoot, he said he kind of made fun of Bob Titmus and said that when he came in, basically he left and never heard from him again, which isn't accurate. He had as close of a relationship to Tom Slick as Peter Byrne did, and actually started the British Columbia expedition. So it was, as a researcher, it was very frustrating doing research. I mean, it's good that Peter Byrne has so many books out that you can get information from, but a lot of his information is inconsistent. A lot of it contradicts itself. And so that's quite frustrating. And
what do you think the reason is that he was doing that?
I would say that I would characterize Peter Byrne the same way I would Ivan Sanderson. I don't think he was a liar. He didn't tell outright lies, but he was economical with the truth. Like, is a nice way to put it. He tended to embellish, on stories and stretch the truth. But I wouldn't call him a blatant liar. He just just very unreliable as a journalist and a writer.
Okay.
Yeah, there's so many folks that we know have done a lot of things with them, between Henry Franzoni and Rick Knoll and obviously Thomas Steenburg. But Dustin, I want to hear about the fight. So I've never heard about this. So can you share with something that what you learned about it?
Yeah. So I'm working about this. That happened in the 70s. So
so it's going to be your next book. But yeah,
that's fine. I can talk about it. Yeah, so it's interesting about both books is the same group of guys: Green, DeHaven, Peter Byrne, all the same guys. So things got really nasty in the 1970s between all these guys. They went to lawsuits, everything. So as the story goes, in the late 1975, Peter Byrne wrote his first Bigfoot book. He used photographs without Renee DeHaven's permission to do so. Renee DeHaven was irate. He went to the Dalles, Oregon, where Peter Byrne was stationed at the time. Apparently, he made threats. So Peter Byrne pressed harassment charges. There actually was a warrant for Renee DeHaven's arrest in Oregon for a few years. So fast forward to, I believe it was December 1978. Renee DeHaven was apparently following Peter Byrne, and he was staying at a Motel 6 outside of Portland. He wakes up in the morning. There's a note on his door from Rick Knoll, who's still alive. And it says, "Hey, I would like to meet you at the McDonald's parking lot." He drives to the McDonald's parking lot, and there is Peter Byrne with fists clenched. And he's like, "I've had enough of it." And he beat Renee's ass from the start. So Renee, what happened? Their lawyers got together and they agreed that Byrne would drop the charges he had for harassment, in turn that Byrne wouldn't press charges for getting beat up.
Wow. And I'm trying to think. Well, Peter Byrne was born in 25, so he wasn't. He wasn't old in 1978, so he wasn't that old. I'm just trying to figure out how old he was.
He was like 50 something, like us.
So I guess I can.
He had a few iterations in North America. So he came the first time in 1960 for the Pacific Northwest expedition, and then after Tom Slick died, he went back to Nepal. Then when the Patterson-Gimlin thing blew up and the Bossberg Cripplefoot blew up, he came back to the States in 1970, and he stayed until 1979, right after that fight occurred. And then he was back to Nepal, and then I believe he came back in 1991, 92, and that time he was in Hood River, Oregon, and where he stayed.
No, wasn't there like a story too where somebody put a gun in somebody's face?
Yeah, I covered that.
We're not talking about that?
Oh, we can.
No, we can talk about that. So
Okay.
it's in the first book, and this is a true story. Even though I wrote it as a scene, this actually is true. So in the summer of 1967, the Blue Creek, there's tracks found on Blue Creek Mountain, which is adjacent watershed to Bluff Creek. And these are actually the tracks that ultimately brought Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin to Bluff Creek later that fall, because they didn't want to see these tracks. And in the process, that's when they got their film. So John Green and Renee DeHaven flew to Blue Creek Mountain, Bluff Creek to see these tracks. Long story. Somehow Renee got stranded on a mountain for several hours by himself, and their relationship, John Green's relationship with Renee, is really becoming more and more frayed. And by the end of the 70s, they weren't talking to each other anymore. Anyway, Renee DeHaven put a gun to his face, threatened to kill him. And that's a true story. So, as a story, I interviewed the pilot who took Renee DeHaven and John Green and a tracking dog there. His name's Keith Kiazar. He's still alive today. He's the one who told me the story. I was like, wait, what happened? He was kind of reluctant to tell me the story. So after he told me, I called Thomas Steenburg. I go, "Have you ever heard this?" And Thomas Steenburg started laughing. Like, yeah, John Green told me that, but he said he would never tell the story until after Renee died. So yeah, it's an absolutely true story. But actually, the relationship did not end there. They continue to have a working relationship. They said they haven't falling out here and there, but throughout the 1970s, they stopped working together in the 1970s, but they still corresponded with each other. But I say by the 1980s, it got really. I mean, I have hundreds of letters between Green and DeHaven, and it gets pretty nasty. Well, it's more one-sided. It's Renee attacking John Green, and it's a sad story. They end up not talking at all towards the end of their lives.
So Dustin, we're running out of time a little bit here. So I definitely wanted to ask you about this new book that you're writing. Have you already started writing it?
I did. So the interesting thing is when I set out to write a book, I wanted to write a book principally about the Patterson-Gimlin film. I wanted to include like what I call the classic period before that, but it ended up being, after a few years, I realized this is far too big of a book. And one could argue the first book is too big. So I ended up splitting it down the middle. I said I'll do a pre-PG film book and a post-PG film book. So it's not a two-part book. And the first book does not end with a to be continued. There's no cliffhanger. There's a full narrative arc with a resolution. But the second book is certainly a sequel. It kind of picks up where part 4 leaves off in Blue Creek Mountain when Renee put the shotgun to John Green's face. So yeah, so the second book covers it pretty much covers the story of the Patterson-Gimlin film and the rise of legend throughout the 1970s. I ended the book in 1979.
Okay.
Because the 1970s was the decade of Bigfoot when it really became a household name. And the significance of 1979 is also when all the court cases between Renee DeHaven and everybody ended. Because if you don't know, Renee DeHaven ended up acquiring the ownership of the Patterson film as well as Patterson's book. Basically, Patterson's entire legacy. That was kind of his obsession in the 1970s. Those kind of came to an end. So when Renee died in 2001, now his 2 sons actually own 51% of the film, and the other 49% is owned by Patty Patterson, who is Roger Patterson's widow, who's still alive today and lives in Yakima. And we'll talk to researchers.
Right. Yeah. I know. Yeah. So your second book. So I just want to talk. It's going to pick up from the Patterson-Gimlin film, which was October 20th, obviously of that year. But I know you mentioned that in your book that 1967 was a pretty important year in the subject, and this kind of transitions into your new book too. What happened before the PG film?
Yeah, so I covered this. So part 4 of my book covers what John Green called the big year of 1967. People say 67, you have the Patterson-Gimlin film, of course, but actually there's some significant events before that. The big one being what I described earlier was the tracks found on Blue Creek Mountain. So that happened in the summer of 1967. It actually happened over Labor Day weekend, the same time they had the Bigfoot Days Parade in Willow Creek, oddly enough. So it was those tracks that end up bringing Patterson-Gimlin to Bluff Creek later that fall. And it's probably the most significant number of tracks ever found by Bigfoot. It was literally about 2,000 tracks found. They were the classic double paw tracks, which were later attributed to Ray Wallace. So it ended up being a nice little climax to my first story, which really kind of focused on the claims made by the Wallace family that he was responsible for making those classic tracks in the early years.
Cool. So if again, as we wind down, if I know you're a skeptic, but if you thought these, if Bigfoot exists, any theories on what they would be?
Well, I would, if I was a believer, I'd fall in the contingent that believe that they're biological animals of flesh and blood. I certainly wouldn't subscribe to I guess they call them the woo, that there's time portals, etc. So I believe it's possible they could exist as, biological animals, but in my opinion, I just feel like it's extremely unlikely that there's a tribe of giant apes in North America and 400 million people with handheld high definition cameras on their person 24/7 can't seem to capture one of them on film. I hope I'm wrong though. So I love Bigfoot. I really, really want to be wrong, but at the end of the day, I am pretty hard skeptic.
So just with your skepticism, because it's nice to have somebody who's a skeptic, because you get to see a point of view that we don't often get to hear or see on this program. So with your skepticism, how do you explain the footprints?
Well, I certainly don't believe that Ray Wallace was responsible for making all the Bigfoot tracks in Bluff Creek, and honestly didn't make them across the world. So it is interesting, as it is fascinating about the tracks, and it was precursors to Bigfoot, of course. What was started, Bigfoot's main precursor was the Yeti, the Abominable Snowman of California. It started the exact same way, where Eric Shipton was the most famous mountaineer in the world at the time in 1951, came across tracks in the Himalayan snow, which is really even more shocking than finding them in North America, because when you talk about, you know, the Himalayas, one of the most treacherous places in the world, you know, interstellar weather, interstellar cold at night. So yeah, it's a fascinating story about all these tracks and
no, I'm just asking you,
possible
Dustin,
explanation.
as a skeptic,
Mhm.
what are the footprints? Like, who's making the footprints?
Well, I think it's a combination of real tracks that become malformed over time for whatever reason, and
So, like a
there's also just a lot of
human is
bear
walking around
tracks.
barefoot.
Bear tracks
Bear?
overlapping each other will probably explain a lot. Let me back up. When it comes to Bigfoot sightings, more specifically, I would divide it in thirds. I would say the third of the people actually do see something that they misidentify. I would say it's probably in most cases a black bear, or they see something else. I'd say another third is what you could call like psychosomatic. People generally believe they saw something. They didn't really see anything at all. And then there's another third who are just people who are just flat out lying. And I say, as far as the tracks, I say some of them are misidentifications. Again, bear paws overlapping, but then there's also cases where there's a lot of people who are faking tracks. And that's something that's been going on for 60, probably forever.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So even like someone like Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who is an anthropologist and basically studies bipedal locomotion and the human gait and all that stuff, you have someone like him who's saying something's making these footprints. They're not fake. There's dermal ridges. There's certain deformities in the footprints that even a podiatrist couldn't fake. What do you say to someone like that?
I have no explanation. I certainly don't claim to be a scientist at all. So
I'm just curious because we don't talk to skeptics very often who happen to know a lot about the Bigfoot world. Like, there's the people at work that are like, Dana, you're crazy, or, but you're really informed. Like, you're like, who's who, what they've done, what they've found. You go out there yourself. So it's just really cool to ask you these questions. So maybe you're not a skeptic. Maybe
I'm
you
like
don't
I said,
know what's making these footprints, and that's what's
again, I'm not an evangelical skeptic. I'm not out there to convince people, I still want to be wrong. I hope there is something out there, but at the end of the day, I can't accept it. But yeah, I want to be wrong, really, really bad.
It's similar to our friend Dr. Esteban Sarmiento, who's a primatologist. Deep down, he wants to believe that there's something out there, but he can't yet. It's
good to be a skeptic. It's good that you're so informed on the subject. So I just love asking these questions because, it comes up with some interesting answers. So, Dustin, since we're actually only got a couple more minutes left here, why don't you tell everybody how they can follow you
and get your book?
Yeah,
and we'll have links too. Bye bye.
Sure. So I don't have a website, so I end up self-publishing the book. I try to go the traditional publishing route. That did not go well, so I'll be self-publishing the second book as well as I'm selling it exclusively on Amazon. So I'm hoping
are you on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook?
I am, but I don't do any type of marketing online.
Okay.
So yeah, it's pretty much just
or even any kind of posts about your expeditions when you're hanging out with all your friends in the Bluff Creek area. And I mean, this is the only.
I'm not good at marketing, obviously, so I probably need to improve in that area. So I'm hoping the next book would be. I'm shooting for October 20th, 2024, for obvious reasons. So I think I can make that date work. So I'm working every day on the books. So I'm hoping I'll have it ready by then.
Cool. I think the book's a greght idea.
It is, the one Dustin has out now. We'll have links, Amazon links in the show, and it's go get the book, guys. It's everyone. It's hard to find a book that the folks in the Bigfoot community all agree that is a good historical, just a good book. And because there's always people who say, yeah, that I don't like this, I don't like that, but
Mhm.
everybody, all the reviews on Dustin's book, just you guys just go check it out.
And also, if you're just a newbie to the Bigfoot world, it's some people like who get new into something, they want to see how it started. You know, they want to see all the nitty gritties. They like that, you know, from the beginning. Let's just see what's going on. So that makes great sense too. But we have to say, Dustin, it's been so
Yes.
awesome to have you on the show. Like, really, it's really been
Can I
nice.
ask Dustin one more question?
Oh my God.
Last question. It'd be one sentence answer. Who's your favorite character from your first book?
I gotta go with Renee DeHaven. Such a crazy dude.
Yeah, cool.
Awesome.
Well, awesome, Dustin. Thank you so much.
We really appreciate you taking the time. We're
Dana,
truly
thank
honored.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks
have a good
again.
day.
Same to you. Cool.
Yeah, wasn't that cool?
Yeah, that was cool. I feel like I learned a lot.
He's I mean, yeah, he's dug in,
He
and we didn't
really
even get to the
has.
letters, and we didn't get into how much time he put into and where he got all the research from. I mean, hours and hours and hours. I know some of the things he had to go that he still had to go in physically. They weren't even on, like, you know, he couldn't go online and find. He had to go to microfiche and things like that to find out. And I mean, I
Yeah.
can't imagine how many hours it's taken him to dig through letters and articles and things. So hats off to Dustin.
Dustin,
for
that's
that.
why you got to get on social media, because you did all this work and so many people would probably be interested in hearing about all of this. But
Yeah, that was great.
yeah, that was cool.
Yeah. So
And we're so appreciative of you guys.
we
We
are.
love seeing your comments. We actually met one of our fans recently that
did.
lives on the West Coast.
Mhm.
So that was a lot of fun. Obviously, we meet a lot of fans when we're at conferences.
Yep.
But it's just so cool to have you guys join us all the time. And I hope you learned something, because we always do.
Yep. So thank you again, guys. Like and subscribe. You know how to find us, and we'll see you next time.
Yep. Thanks, guys.